Hey everyone, welcome back to The Epic Investor. I'm here with Jason and James, and we are here to talk about gaining clarity while working through chaos. And we've just, it's a topic that you may not think applies to you, but we've seen that 100% that on your journey to achieving freedom of purpose, achieving clarity regularly is critical to long-term success. So let's get started. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm sitting here with Jason and James, and I wanted to talk about gaining clarity while working through chaos, because this is something I've seen 100% of the time keeping people from reaching that place of freedom that they want to be at. And I first wanted to start with a story. And this story, if you guys are history buffs, this is back in the 1940s, World War II era. In particular, 1939, February 14th, the German Navy launched its probably the most advanced warship of the day on the planet. It was called the Bismarck. And to give you an idea about this massive project, there was 57,000 blueprints that made up this, and they had 380 millimeter radar controlled guns, 28,000 miles of electric circuitry, and they added 35,000 tons of armor. This thing was a behemoth. It was massive. It was essentially built to be indestructible, and it was. 2 years after the launch, on May 24th, 1941, it had its first fight at sea, and it engaged the two finest ships of the British Navy. In under 4 minutes, this warship sank the hood. It severely damaged the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales was able to turn around and get out of there fast enough. And then 3 days later, the British Navy knew that it had to send everything at it to sink the ship. And to give you an idea, they sent 8 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and 21 destroyers to take out this one ship. And I have to tell you, shell after shell only inflicted superficial damage. They weren't touching it. There was nothing that they could do. And the firepower on this ship was devastating. I mean, it literally was going to change the course of the world as we know it. Until one torpedo, by fate, whatever it might have been, struck the rudder and damaged it. And so the Bismarck was only able to go in a slow circle. And what happened after that, so it was far enough away that the German Air Force, it was too far out. There wasn't any backup ship. It didn't need any backup ships, right? But ultimately, what happened was the German Navy decided that it was better to scuttle and sink their own ship than let that ship go into the hands of the British Navy. And so they did. I wanted to start with this to talk about, in business, we have all of these things in place, right? You got processes and systems, and you can build this massive behemoth. But unless you have a rudder to guide it, you're just going to go in circles and ultimately not make it to the end of the day. But have you guys ever heard of that story before about the Bismarck?
I'm actually offended that I've never heard this story before. Of all the schooling and everything I've done, what a great story.
Yeah, it was taught to me by actually Thomas S. Monson, and he was giving a talk, and in my life, when I heard it at the time, it just showed how important it is for us to have purpose or something, a guiding light. It's like a lighthouse in the midst of the storm, right? To guide you through when things go wrong. And what I want to talk about today is when things go wrong in business. Well, number one, things are going to go wrong, right? No plan survives first contact with reality. And when we're in the midst of all of that chaos, how do we get through? What makes it possible for us to get to the end of the row and keep the business alive? And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. And there's some stories on when I've gone through chaos, some recent, and I wanted to share those with you guys, and then get your feedback on some of the things that you've done or experienced when you've gone through chaotic times in your life. Who this really speaks to is, as the epic investor, because no plan survives first contact with reality, and we have an idea of what we want to accomplish at the beginning. And then when things start going wrong and teams don't work out as well and things change, we it there's a tendency to forget about the real purpose by why we were doing what we were doing to begin with. And then it turns into you're just fighting all of the symptoms over and over again. A couple examples. I had so it's right after I graduated from MBA school. I got a position and moved to California, in East Bay, and super excited. Moved the family out there, and that first month did actually really well in the position I was at, and the merger acquisition that I was excited about moving out there for fell through, and so about 40 days into our year lease there in California, I found myself without a job. Obviously didn't turn out the way I was wanting, but when you're in a situation where things are not going as planned, we tripled our expenses by moving out to California. And yeah, it was very expensive. And there was people in our neighborhood that would commute 5 hours a day to get to there, and that was, you're almost forced to do things like that if that's, we were living on above the Altamont Pass over by a place called Mountain House, and great neighbors. We just had a great experience with everyone around, but the environment that I was in was quite devastating. So how do I get through it? Well, I knew that I couldn't just. I actually tried applying for job. You go through that process, and for me, it was more and more frustrating every day of putting the effort into doing something and then having not the response that I was hoping for, and this cloud and weight just being added to my shoulders of how am I going to provide for my family and do this the right way, and what would any reasonable rational person do? So I started a business.
I knew that was coming.
And not just any business, a tech startup, right? And it's why I'm a two-time patent holder today. But I knew I needed to get information. And I was like, well, how in the world am I going to provide for my family, do market research? And at the time, I just took some time away. And I said, oh, how am I going to make it or how am I going to get through this, right? And this was back in 2016. And it was a time when Uber and Lyft were a really big thing. I mean, that it was kind of new, and a lot of people were looking at that, and people would work during the day and then drive at night and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, if I drive, how can I make this work? And it dawned on me, I could drive in the San Francisco financial district and interview as many people as I possibly could, and to do my own market research for the tech startup. So that's what I did. I started driving in that area, and not everyone was a good fit, but out of 1,000 rides, there was probably 400 that were a good fit to interview. And I had anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour with these people. And I just asked them if it was okay for me to just ask them questions about, to get an idea of what they were experiencing on the financial side, and their personal data, and what it meant to them. And that's how we came up with the electronic personal record. And it's essentially the concept of being able to control everything, all of the data that you own, financial data, and be able to share it with all of the different providers that you work with, instead of each provider having that information as a silo. But there's no way I would have been able to go through and get that information if I didn't take some time and just think through what I call take a clarity break is really what I'm referring to there. And
So you mentioned in there, the need for that ability to break away, to clear your head, and then you define that as a clarity break. Is that something that you are like, and I have reasons for asking this question, but was that like forced on you? Like, your wife said, you need to just disappear for a day because I can't handle this? Or was it employees going, dude, you're too much? Or were you just in such a place where you were like, I have to go fishing and reset? Like, I'd love to know how you arrived at, I need a clarity break.
it actually goes much further back into my childhood. I grew up on a farm. There's something that happens when you're out by yourself working on that tractor. Whether you're cutting the hay or baling or or even like doing irrigation. It's just things you have to do all the time. It takes a lot of time, and so you have a lot of personal time to think. And so I grew up like that. And if I could go out and start hauling some hay, I would have been in heaven, right? And I'd be able to think through it. I just didn't have access to that. But I think that's really where it came from, out of the experience I had of just spending time with my own thoughts, and the power that gave me early in my childhood, and then applying it at that time. It's shaped quite a bit of what we've done today, and we'll share some things that James and I learned, and everyone that's been in real estate for decades will remember the 2008-2009 crisis, right? It was a real estate crisis for sure, and depending on what area of the country you were in, you were hit harder than others, or depending what types of projects you were in, and there, to me, that's just a great example of chaos. And I think some of the symptoms are when you start reaching out to other people for their advice on how you're going to handle something. That's an example of chaos setting in. You don't have a clear picture yourself, so you're reaching for other people to tell you what that clarity should be. I don't know. Have you ever had experience in your lives where you were unsure about where you were going, and then the reaction was to start asking everyone else for their advice to tell you what you should do, instead of actually digging in deep to learn what it is that you were truly meant for?
I think just about every big stage in my life, I felt that way. I'd say starting at Epic Capital was kind of like that. Big transition, sort of uncertainty around what the future was going to look like. And luckily, I do have great mentors. So I did, leverage my network and kind of reach out and ask for advice. But it's true, we learned over the last 6 to 8 months, like taking a step back just on your own, finding clarity on your own, asking yourself those important questions. That's really huge. And while other people's advice can be impactful and helpful, I think overall, like if you can take that step back and just think, all right, I'm going to go up to the mountains like we do, or go to the Boise River Greenbelt and just say, what needs to happen right now in my life for me to kind of start to advance the right direction that I want to go? And unfortunately, I didn't really do that back then. But now that it's part of our system and our structure at Epic Capital, the clarity breaks, right? They're weekly. We all do them. And I think we can all attest to the fact that it's made a huge difference for all three of us in our lives.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of paint the picture, as the Epic investor, when they have investments that don't go as planned, that chaos sets in, right? And then you make decisions based on that fear and greed, or what's happening during the moment. And I think a lot of investors, they were faced with, if I don't sell everything I have now, I'll lose everything. So that they would sell real estate at the bottom of the market. They would sell a business at the bottom of the market, whatever it might be, because they felt like that was the only way out. And how many of those investors would love to own those properties or businesses at what they paid for them originally, and today? And every one of them would love to have that. And I think the power of clarity is taking a step back and getting to the root of the why behind it, and start focusing on what truly matters rather than the means to get you there.
You know, I if I can interject for a minute, Nate, and James reminded me of this. I had a phone call last year during a transitional part of my life, and I had reached out to this guy. We were networked together. One of my local friends connected me to him through a networking opportunity, and he's like a recruiter, an executive talent, acquisitionist, let's call him. And so I had every intention of getting on this call, trying to shine and showcase my best attributes and tell him what I think I wanted, and that he was going to place me in some, solid opportunity. And it was really refreshing when he said, "Hey, let's just slow the conversation for a second. And I've been where you are, and let me, if you don't mind, let me just tell you what I did." And he offered all this like really great advice and counsel that I didn't ask for, but I was happy to receive. And he said, I've got several opportunities that I could easily place you in, but I want you to go spend like 2 months and he said, take every trip you meant to take and didn't, spend time reading, spend time journaling, spend time meditating, get to the gym, do everything you have meant to do, intended to do, and never did. Take your wife out every night. And I really loved his genuine approach to what he could have personally benefited from by, placing somebody, and he would have closed a deal for his firm. Instead, he took the personal approach and said, do this. And so we actually took his advice, and we went to Idaho and played cowboy for a couple of weeks, and, wrangled some cows. And it was calving season, which I don't want to spend too much time sharing stories about that. I did not grow up on a farm, Rich, so it was a ton of fun for me. But I was grateful, though, that kind of advice of, you need to get away from it all, and you need to dig. You need to understand what you want and where you're really at and what that really looks like. And you can't do that in, a 10-minute car ride. That takes time, intentionality, and days of like clearing your head of all of the noise before you finally get to that back corner of, this is what I really want. So it was wildly impactful for me.
I love that. We've had we had an experience recently that has made that impact as well, Jason. And we were, James and I were having a strategy meeting around, what we're doing in the business going forward. And typically you go into the conference room with the whiteboard and start, putting everything out there and just hash through it. Right. And I love those workshops. But on this one, it was a little bit different, where instead we decided to have our strategy meeting up in the mountains. And we met, we drove up, and we started with what we call a segue, personal and business good news, and then we started with what we were grateful for. And then instead of diving into, we had these problems that we were trying to solve, right? And to come back with these strategies of what we wanted to accomplish. And I think the main key takeaway for me is, had we stayed in the office, we would have come up with some great strategies, and I think we would have moved forward, but the focus would have been on the means of what we were doing to accomplish that goal instead of the why. And what happened out in being out in the open and just having that perspective of seeing the valley down below and the trees and the greenery, just, God's beauty, that, nature's beauty of everything around us. It forces you to have a different perspective on what the real problems are. And we kind of took everything aside and focused on the why. Why are we wanting to go in a certain direction with, our investors and with our partners? And, why is helping them achieve their freedom of purpose so important to us? And what's interesting is when you focus on that end goal, that purpose, everything starts falling into place of what needs to happen. Versus if we focus on a strategy, then that strategy becomes the purpose. And you do it and you're like, I'm done. I've done all the work I needed to do. I'm done, but the results aren't quite there yet, right? And I don't know, James, if you wanted to share kind of what your experience was with that. But I just absolutely enjoyed that time with you in that strategy session.
Yeah, likewise. No, I agree. I think first and foremost, it's just a matter of breaking the cycle, right? As you mentioned, getting outside of the office into something, into a new venue, was so important. I think for us, getting to the mountains was nice. It speaks the word clarity, right? And ultimately, as you discussed, be focused on the why. And it's kind of like that book, Start With Why. That's where everything comes from. If you start to deviate from the why, you start talking about how. Obviously, how is important, but it has to start with why. You have to know why you're doing this, why you're showing up to work every single day, the ultimate impact that you want to make on your customers. And I think just stepping away from the office and into a new setting, it's just huge, and it changes your perspective a lot. And I think the ideas that we came up with while we were out there were completely different than what we would have come up with if we had just been at the drawing board in the back office.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
I was taught a lesson once when I was about 20 years old from a mentor of mine. Pivotal part of life, right? You're kind of in no man's land. You think you know what you're doing, yet you have no clue. I remember, simple lesson, probably insignificant for many of you, but for me it was pivotal. I would eat my breakfast at the table, and I would also study at the table. And this mentor said, your brain cannot determine what you're doing. Are you studying or are you eating? And therefore it's divided, right? It's not focused on one thing or the other. And so they suggested that I don't study where I eat, that if I eat at the table, prepare food at the table, then do that. But if I'm going to study, not just like casually flip through something, but if I'm going to like study something, then you need to go to the desk where you prepare documents or study or read and learn. And therefore your mind is trained that way. And so when you sit in an office, right, you're in work mode. It's what's the problem? What's the solution? Get it done, move to the next one. My phone's ringing. I got an email that came in, you're distracted. But when you go to the woods, right? In my opinion, God's country, you go to the splendor of these creations, your mind is different. It's already in a receptive position instead of an attack mode of work. So kudos to both of you for doing that. I think that's, if anybody takes anything from this, I think that's a tremendous challenge.
Well, I think it kind of speaks to, we've discussed the whole 10x is easier than 2x book. I think going out in that different setting puts you in the 10x mindset, right? Because you have to find a different way to approach your problems and your business strategies. Whereas if you're in the office, it's kind of like that 2x mindset. It's doing more of what we're currently doing versus changing setting, changing strategy. All of a sudden, as we mentioned before, we were thinking about 10x type ideas versus just doing more of the same thing. So that's what I would add to that as well.
And I think the biggest impact to me is by doing that and getting clarity on the why and what we were focusing on was like that rudder. It gave Epic the ability to direct that rudder in the direction of what was most important and letting go of the things that just didn't matter. That was just a huge pivotal piece for me. And we incorporate clarity breaks, on a weekly basis now. And, what that means to me is just taking some time. It doesn't have to be a long time, but taking some time and asking important questions, like just as simple as, what do I need to do more of? What do I need to do less of? Or what do I need to stop doing? What's the one thing that I should be focused on this quarter? What's the one thing I need to give up? And it just having that clarity break on a regular basis is what helps cut through the storm, and allows me to grab hold of that rudder so I can steer in the direction that's truly important. Well, that's all we've got today. But just in wrapping up, clarity is what gives you the rudder to work through the greatest challenges and problems. And as a Epic investor, being able to take a step back and focus on what's truly important to you will help navigate through the decisions that you need to make. If there's anything that we've said or that you could share, subscribe and share with your friends. We welcome anyone who would like to reach out and talk about their experiences or share what's worked for you. And also, if you want to learn more about how we take our clarity breaks and what we do, we're an open book. But until next time, have a great one.